Wonderful. Well, thank you all so much for being here today with me. For those of you who are on live on the webinar, you have the opportunity to put any questions that you have in the chat. In the past, there had been a Q&A box. I don't see that here right now. So anyway, just put your questions in the chat if that's okay with you. And we have our topic today, which is carbs, yes, no, or maybe. Hopefully by the end of our session today, you will be completely educated or at least have a pretty good idea of how carbohydrates work in your body, and kind of what types there are, which kinds are best, and how you can use that information to make informed choices about the foods you eat. So I'll just tell you about me really quick for those of you who haven't attended any of my webinars. For some of you who've come to like all of them for 16-ish years, you're going to be bored by this. You could probably recite my thing for me, but my name is Julie Lanford, and I am the Community Engagement Director at Cancer Services. We're a local nonprofit agency in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. And I created cancerdietitian.com in 2007 when I was working as an outpatient oncology dietitian at one of our local cancer centers. I created the website to be a resource to answer just the common questions that I would get from my clients that I didn't have time to answer in our one-on-one appointments. And I wanted to be able to regularly provide them with updated evidence-based nutrition information. So I created cancerdietitian.com, and when I came on staff at Cancer Services, we incorporated it as part of our survivorship programs because I wanted that to be a resource that's available to cancer patients and survivors and caregivers at no charge. All of our programs at Cancer Services are available at no charge. So they cover all the costs of the website, including my time, the website itself, and all those things, so that you all can take advantage of those benefits and information at no fee. So that is how I am able to do this, and I love doing it. And so I'm grateful to have a job that supports that. I am a registered dietitian nutritionist. I'm a board certified specialist in oncology nutrition. I have to take that exam every 5 years to prove that I am current in my knowledge. It's not easy or fun, but I am proud of myself for passing every time. I have a master's in public health from UNC Chapel Hill, and I did my bachelor's degree in biology from NC State. And I have also done an executive certificate in nonprofit leadership from Duke University. So for anybody who's in North Carolina, you know that I've now just covered like the 3 points of the triangle. And so I just always bring this information to remind you that when you're getting nutrition advice or information, especially around cancer, you want to make sure you're getting it from a qualified professional. And dietitians are the profession that has accredited programs and supervised internships and exams that we have to prove. And so what I would like to say is if you get nutrition information that you're not sure is evidence-based, or you're getting some information from somebody who maybe isn't trained in nutrition from an accredited university, that perhaps you would double check and make sure that that's actually accurate, because there is a lot of misinformation out there. I might argue there's more incorrect or not evidence-based information about nutrition than there is actual fact or science-based information. So I hope that I'll clear some things up about carbs today and kind of give you a little bit more freedom around your food choices and helping others to make positive food choices for their bodies. So today's agenda, we are going to talk about, first of all, what are carbs? Second of all, carbohydrate myths and truths. I kind of put that up front because people always love when I myth bust and they want to hear that first. Then, which carbs are the most nutritious and how much carbohydrate do you need? So here we go. First of all, understanding what are carbs. Carbohydrates are actually a macronutrient, and macronutrient means you eat kind of a large amount of them in order to provide your body with energy. Now, energy in food is measured as calories. So when you hear the word calorie, I want you to think energy. A lot of times in our culture, people have sort of assumed that if something is low calorie, it's good, and if it's high calorie, it's bad. And I would like for us to stop thinking that way. Rather, I want you to think about the fact that calories are energy. Do you need a low energy snack or do you need a high energy snack? What kinds of nutrition are you looking for when you're going to eat? So I think that I generally, when I eat something, I want energy. So low calorie is not necessarily what I'm going for. But carbohydrates do provide you with calories or energy, which is important. It's also called a macronutrient as opposed to micronutrients, which only takes a very small amount to meet your body's needs. So things like vitamins and minerals are micronutrients. Macronutrients are carbohydrates, protein, fat. We need kind of a lot of it to provide our energy. Carbohydrates are found in multiple food groups. They are not just one food group. And they contain nutrients that are broken down and absorbed as glucose, which is how we measure blood sugar. We look at how much glucose is in the blood. And they also are a building block of energy for all of our cells. So when our cells need to function, they use glucose and convert that. That's like the gasoline for our bodies. Glucose is basically what gives our bodies, or the cells of our bodies, the fuel to function. So we do need glucose. If your glucose drops below a certain level, you are not alive. If your glucose gets low, many of us can sense when it's getting low. We start getting a little shaky, or if you have diabetes or blood sugar management issues, you notice when your blood sugar is low and you need to provide your body with glucose quickly. So we do need that glucose. If it gets too low in our blood, we don't survive. So our body has ways to compensate if we don't consume enough sources of glucose in any period of time. We'll talk about that in a minute. So understanding the food groups that contain carbohydrates. Oh, look, my vegetable S dropped to the next line. So that's really going to bug me this whole time. But fruits, vegetables, specifically starchy vegetables. So there's starchy vegetables and non-starchy vegetables, which is a little confusing in the vegetable category. But starchy vegetables are potatoes, corn, peas, and beans, like legumes, are also a starchy vegetable. So fruits, starchy vegetables, grains, dairy products have carbohydrates as well. And then sweets. Of course, that's what everyone thinks of. When you think of carbs, you think of sweets. But actually, there are a lot of food groups that contain carbohydrates. So we're going to cover some of those and how they work in our bodies. But yes, sweets, and I put a sugar sweetened beverage on here as an example, that those are areas that we do get carbohydrates. And many people think of that, but it's quite a wide range of foods that can provide our body with carbohydrates. All right, so here are the four. We're just picking on 4 common carbohydrate myths that I'm going to bust. So the things you see on the screen are myths. I don't want you leaving this webinar thinking that I told you fruit is high in sugar. No, I consider that a myth. Sugar feeds cancer is a myth. If you attended my Hot Topics webinar and read my website for any amount of time, you know that I spend a significant amount of time busting this one. A low carb diet is recommended is a myth. And the idea that carbohydrates cause weight gain is not a truth. It is a myth, or maybe a little bit of misinformation. Of course, myths always start with like a kernel of truth that is blown out of proportion and things are taken out of context. And then that's what basically makes them untrue. So let's go through the truths on these. First of all, the myth that fruit is high in sugar. I mean, this just wants to make my brain blow apart. Because first of all, high, how would you define high in sugar? And what type of sugar are we talking about here? So the idea that fruit is, quote, high in sugar is very simplistic and is not, defined whatsoever. So I would tell you, fruit does have sugar in it. It has natural sugars. And what makes something high in sugar? There's not a definition for that. I wouldn't call it high in sugar anyway. Even the natural sugars that are in there, they're good for you, and they're packaged with other important nutrients that your body needs. So fiber, vitamins, phytonutrients. I wouldn't say that fruit is high in sugar. I would say fruit is an appropriate source of natural sugars that are delicious and good for us and comes in the perfect proportion with the other healthy nutrients that come in the food along with the natural sugars. So no, fruit is not high in sugar. Fruit has the perfect amount of sugar. Second myth is that a low carb diet is recommended. There are no health organizations that are based on evidence-based nutrition that suggests a low carb or no carb diet. So low carb or no carb diets eliminate many food groups and therefore eliminate essential nutrients. Our brains need 130 grams of carbohydrates a day to function properly. So if we don't provide glucose, our body is forced to make it. Now, I will say there's like one circumstance that I know of where a very low carbohydrate diet or a ketogenic, like a true ketogenic, medical ketogenic diet, not like just what people are eating when they claim they're on a keto diet. No, I'm talking about medical nutrition therapy where it is designed to form ketones in your body. It has been proven beneficial for a certain percentage of children with types of epileptic seizures. And so for adults, this isn't really proven to be helpful for them. And if a child were to need to go on a no or very low carbohydrate ketogenic diet, they actually really need a very close following by a medical team and guidance from a specialized dietitian. So for the most part, though, health organizations are not recommending low carb diets. They're recommending consuming, the right amount of carbohydrates, which we will get to. Next, we have my least favorite myth. Sugar, quote, feeds cancer. That is not true. There is not evidence showing that if somehow you cut out sugar, that will eliminate the cancer in your body. It doesn't work that way. Sugar actually, if you're going to say it feeds cancer, it actually feeds every cell of our body. We don't get to pick and choose which cells get what fuel, and glucose is necessary for good health and brain function for everyone. Even if somebody does have a cancer diagnosis, it is not like you eat sugar and all of a sudden your cancer grows and the sugar only goes there. When we eat, our body digests and absorbs all the nutrients and it flows around in our blood for the cells to pick up as they need. It does not preferentially send sugar to cancer cells. All right, and the last myth we're busting today before we get moving on with the facts and kind of educating you, giving you a little nutrition class on carbs. The last myth is that carbohydrates cause weight gain. There is no evidence that low carbohydrate diets are any more effective at promoting intentional weight loss over any other calorically restricted diet. So there is no evidence that somehow eating more carbohydrates results in weight gain or restricting carbohydrates results in weight loss any more than any other calorie like controlled situation. However, I would also caution, just like I said, I want us to change the conversation around calories being bad or low calorie being good and high calorie being bad. Calorie is just energy. We need energy. We want energy. I mean, who wants low energy? Everybody wants high energy, right? For the most part. I want to change the conversation around weight. Weight loss does not mean a nourished body. So if somebody is losing a lot of weight, to me, that is a cause for concern. I don't think that weight loss in general necessarily means good health. What we want is for you to have a nourished body, regardless of what your weight is. And when we key in on nourishing your body and doing, physical activity that feels good to you, that brings joy to your life and also uses your muscles, that is the way to have a healthy lifestyle that supports not just your physical health, but your mental health, your brain health, all of the things. So I don't use weight as an outcome measure as to diet quality unless I'm actually working with patients who need to put weight on and we're trying to use that as a measure as are they eating enough. When it comes to what does a healthy weight actually mean, we have no way of knowing for you. There's no like magic calculator that knows. So I always encourage people to really just pay attention to what's going on in your body, what gives you energy, what helps your intestines function well, what helps your brain feel regulated and settled, and that those are the measures we want to look at rather than just weight. Okie dokie. So the role of carbohydrates in our nourishment plan is to get an adequate amount each day as an energy source and to provide that glucose to all of the cells of our body in order for them to run. Because the glucose is essential for all cells, and especially your brain and muscle cells, your brain has to have glucose to function because of the way that things are processed and cross the blood-brain barrier. Only glucose can cross the blood-brain barrier. So we want you to get the adequate amount of glucose to have the energy you need to function well. So the types of carbohydrates, there are two main types of carbohydrates when we split them into groups. One is simple carbohydrates and the second is complex carbohydrates. So we're going to talk through both of these to really understand when it comes to foods, what is a simple carbohydrate, what is a complex carbohydrate, and how much should we have in a day. So simple carbs, these are the things that most people think of when they think of sugar, or sort of, you know, if they think carbs are bad, these are the carbs they're thinking of, is just sugars. So there are foods that, you know, there's no, well, okay, I take that back. There's basically kind of just one type of food that is only sugar, and that's a syrup or straight up, you know, table sugar. So sugar sweetened beverages are essentially providing you with sugar and nothing else, right? And then eating sugar cubes or, you know, sugar itself is just sugar with nothing else. But pretty much all other foods are actually a combination of different types of carbohydrates. But in these examples, there is a high concentration of simple sugars compared to the rest of what makes up that particular food. So we have Fruit Loops on this picture. You know, Fruit Loops aren't actually fruit, just in case you didn't know. And it's not even spelled F-R-U-I-T. It's spelled F-R-O-O-T. And yes, my children love them. They are, right, like probably a high amount of sugar versus other types of carbohydrate in the mix. Same thing with our cakes, our processed crackers, our chips or whatever, tend to be higher amounts of the simple carbohydrates in combination of much fewer amounts of the complex carbohydrates. So simple sugars is what we call them. Sucrose is the most common type of simple sugar that most people would know. That's table sugar. Maltose is a type of sugar that we don't really eat much of. And then lactose is a milk sugar. So when we consume table sugar, which is sucrose, that's just fructose and glucose bonded together. Our digestive system breaks up the bonds and we absorb the fructose and glucose separately. So that happens, you know, in our intestinal systems, not in our stomachs. Our stomachs basically kind of just unfold things and, you know, mix everything up. It's really more of our small intestine where a lot of this sort of piecing apart of our food into individual nutrients happens, and then those nutrients are absorbed into the blood. So fructose and glucose, when they're bonded together, are white sugar. Interestingly, honey is basically the same thing. It's just that the bees have broken the bonds for us. So when we eat honey, that's glucose and fructose, and the bonds are already broken, and then we just absorb them that way. So that's why we say honey and table sugar are very similar. Basically, they're not different when from a nutritional standpoint. All the other types of syrups, corn syrups, agave syrup, maple syrup, they're all different basically, but the same forms of sucrose or glucose plus fructose combined together. Now, high fructose corn syrup, probably, you know, it does have more fructose than the regular corn syrup. But when it comes down to it, they're all essentially the same in terms of the volume of simple sugars to water. All right, so what does glucose and fructose do in our bodies? Glucose is absorbed into the blood. It's carried for use by all of our cells. Like it is ready to go to make your cells run. fructose is absorbed as fructose, and then it's converted by the liver into a glucose-like substance that is essentially just treated like glucose. So it's kind of like fructose gets into the blood, the liver grabs it, changes it to glucose, spits it back out into the blood, and then all your cells can use it. And this is an amazing system. I mean, amazing. Our bodies are quite amazing. And then that's what gives us energy. That's what makes our brains keep going. That's what makes our, muscles keep going and our immune system function, and just everything in our body runs on glucose. All those cells need glucose to run. And then when we look at the other types of disaccharides, di means two. So this is like bonded two monosaccharides are bonded together. That makes a disaccharide. So lactose, which is our milk sugar, which some people do not tolerate. They're lactose intolerant because they don't have the enzyme to break this bond apart. So lactose, or milk sugar, is glucose plus galactose that's bonded together. Our bodies break that bond if we have the enzymes in our intestines, and then they're absorbed the same way. Glucose and lactose both absorbed, or glucose and galactose. And then galactose is quickly converted into glucose, and basically there it is, ready for all your cells. So for people who are lactose intolerant, all you need is that bond to be broken. When that bond is not broken and your intestines don't have the enzyme that can split that apart, that's what causes all the digestive issues, because it can't be absorbed into the blood as a combo sugar. It needs to be individual sugars. When they're comboed together and they're stuck together and it can't come apart, then the bacteria, the good, healthy bacteria in your intestines, they have a party because they're like, ooh, this is for us because you can't use it. And then that's where the gas is forming in your intestines and you're very uncomfortable, and it can cause diarrhea and all those things. So there is a product that breaks this bond apart, right? And lactate milk, they break the bond apart for the milk. So that's why you can drink it, because this bond is broken before you put it in your mouth, and then your body can absorb the glucose and galactose because the work is done. Or the lactate pills, basically when you take that while drinking milk, they break up the bonds and you can absorb them. So it's actually a pretty easy fix if you're lactose intolerant, to just buy the lactose free or the lactate where the bonds are already broken down. If you've noticed, if you drink lactate, it's a little bit sweeter to the tongue than regular cow's milk. And that's because when they break these bonds apart, your taste buds can sense the sweetness. So that's why it's a little sweeter. Okay, so that's the simple carbohydrates. That's basically it. Sugar is essentially just broken down into glucose, and your body uses it to fuel the cells. Now, starches and fibers are what make up complex carbohydrates. So complex carbohydrates have simple sugars, or those disaccharides, in combination with more complex starches and fibers. And we'll talk about fiber in a minute, but it's undigestible. So starches are digestible, fibers are not digestible, and then simple sugars are very digestible. So the process of taking a complex carbohydrate and breaking it down into simple sugars and starches and fibers, and then breaking starches down into individual glucose, that process requires more time and more effort in your body. So it slows down the digestive process. That means that your blood sugars rise at a slower rate because it's going into your blood at a slower rate, because your body's like, well, let me work on this a little bit, and then poop, send some glucose in. Let me work on this over here. Poop, send some glucose in. Whereas if you just drink a sweet tea or a soda with nothing else, goes into your stomach, it's into your intestines. Your intestines are like, boop, that's easy. Let's just break this one little bond and send it out into the blood, and your blood sugar goes up fast. If you've heard of the glycemic index, that basically measures how fast an individual food will be absorbed into the blood. Now, the glycemic index I don't think is particularly useful because it is measured on 100 grams of one food item. No one would ever eat 100 grams of carrots by themselves or 100 grams of white potatoes by themselves. We eat foods in meals. So what's more useful is glycemic load, which tends to give you a little bigger picture of, when you're eating these foods, how fast does it raise your blood sugar? But if you eat a potato with, some beans and you put sour cream and cheese and tomatoes on your potato, how is that going to raise your blood sugar? It's going to be lower because it's going to take more time to digest. So these complex carbohydrates contain many nutrients that are packaged in the food along with sugars. So there's some sugar, there's some starches, which are basically like glucose bonded together in long strings, and then fibers and lots of other nutrients, including vitamins, minerals, phytochemicals, probiotics, actually prebiotics, the food for good bacteria. So for those of you who are lactose intolerant, the lactose can be food for your bacteria. You don't want that. But fiber itself and some other probiotics are great things to help keep the good bacteria around. And you can watch my gut health webinar to learn more about that. But these are all things your bodies need. Your body needs this in order to get the tools that it needs to function. So examples of complex carbohydrates: oats, wheat, quinoa, rice, corn, fruit, vegetables, beans, whole grains. All great sources of complex carbohydrates that can give you all that nutrition that you need. So complex carbs contain a variety of nutrients that we need for good brain, muscle, and gut function. It's like the perfect combination of nutrients all packaged into a food. That's delicious, hopefully. Whole grains are one type of grain, okay? So we've talked about there's several different food groups. When we talk about the starch or the grain group, we prefer that you eat whole grains because when you have the whole version of the grain, you get all the components rather than just the starchy part. So a whole grain you see in this picture, it has three components: a bran, endosperm, and germ. The bran is that fiber on the outside. The endosperm is the starchy carbohydrate on the inside, and then the germ is a little seed that is nutrient packed with B vitamins, vitamin E, phytochemicals, healthy fats, all in there that are for the plant to use for its growth. And then when we take the plant, grind it up, turn it into flour, make some bread, then we eat that, and those nutrients help to nourish our bodies. And that's how we're designed. The thing is, when you refine flour, so if you have refined grains, either refined flour from whole wheat flour to white flour, or brown rice to white rice, or whatever whole grain has taken to become a refined grain, they remove the bran, so there goes the fiber. They remove the germ, so there goes a lot of those nutrients, and what they leave behind is that starchy endosperm, which makes it such, white bread is so fluffy and a little bit gummy, because all it has is the endosperm. For the most part, we want to be consuming the whole grain because the bran's good for you and the germ is good for you, and we want it in the same proportion as it's grown in the plant. So when we say 100% whole grain, that means it has all three parts in the same proportion. Yes, it's okay to eat refined white grains sometimes. You don't have to do whole grains all the time. But when we talk about your food pattern, your food intake pattern, it's like, what do you have most of the time? There are lots of different grains. So in the US, we tend to eat a lot of wheat because it grows here. It's inexpensive. That makes the food cheaper. There's nothing wrong with wheat. We'll talk about it in a minute. But there are also wide varieties of grains. And in different parts of the world, different types grow better. So that's why some of these we don't really eat much in the US, or we have to kind of find them at specialty stores. Ancient grains are what some of these are fit into a category. So aromanth, barley, I think is pretty common in the US. Buckwheat, which is actually not a type of wheat. Bulgur. Corn is a type of grain, especially the starchy corn, like popcorn. Einkorn is just another plant. Farro, freekeh, kamut, millet, oats, very cheap and common in the US. Quinoa, which I like. Rice is a great grain. Rye, sorghum, spelt, teff. Teff is one of my favorite breakfast grains. And then wheat. So there are lots of different types of grains. I had someone in a class yesterday ask, well, what's the difference between 100% whole wheat and 100% whole grain? Wheat is one type of grain. So 100% whole wheat is only all parts of the wheat that makes that bread. That's fine. That makes a good bread. if you have a little mix of a few different grains, say you have some oat flour, you have some rice flour, and you have wheat flour, that's multiple grains. It could be called a whole 100% multi-grain bread because there's multiple types of grain in it. Either one of those is a perfectly good choice. What we're looking for is 100%. So on the food labels for bread or pasta or whatever, they can't lie about the percent. So if on the front of the package it says 100%, that can't be a lie. However, if it says made with whole grains or, you know, some odd grams of whole grains included, that means it's a mix of some whole grains and some not whole grains. So when you read the ingredient list, you want to look for whole grain, whatever, whole grain oats, whole grain wheat flour, whole grain rice. If you see the word enriched, that's when it's a processed flour. Okay, so we talked that fiber is important. It is especially important for gut health because it is undigestible. So fiber is something that's in your food. You eat the food, your body digests and absorbs. So that means it takes the nutrients from the intestines into the blood. That's the absorption process. And then what's left over, the fiber is left. And that fiber is in there, and your good bacteria can kind of feed on it. And then whatever is left after your body uses up all the nutrients that it can get out of the food and then pulls out in the large intestine, your body actually absorbs as much water as it can out of the food. And what's left is what becomes a formed stool. And that's when we have a bowel movement and go use the bathroom. So fiber is important. That's why we say if you're constipated, you probably need more fiber. Or, if your gut health you think is a little bit off, we want to see how much fiber are we eating? Can we get more fiber? It helps also to regulate our blood sugar levels because the presence of fiber slows down how fast your food moves from your stomach to your intestines, which means it won't put glucose into the blood if your food's still in your stomach. So if it slows down how fast the food goes from the stomach to the intestines, then that slows down how fast the glucose can get from the intestines into the blood. And then that means it can be a more steady rise and a steady sort of drop back down rather than a spike up and a drop down. And that's when we tend to kind of not feel that great. So important for gut health as well as blood sugar levels and just overall digestive functioning. There are two types of fiber. Soluble fiber is the one that tends to gum up water. So if you've ever taken a fiber supplement, you put it in the water. If you let it sit for a while, it would kind of turn into like a jelly. That is soluble fiber. Soluble, of course, means it's soluble in water. That means that the water can absorb the fiber and it turns into that gel form. It does help lower glucose levels. It's been known to help lower blood cholesterol because it binds in to the bile so that it can't be reabsorbed, and then that helps to lower that cholesterol. So food sources of soluble fiber, oatmeal. This is why oats get that, red heart on any of their products because oatmeal has been shown to help lower cholesterol. Nuts are good sources of soluble fiber. Beans, lentils, apples, blueberries. So when people say apples are just nature's sugar water. No, it's not. There's great soluble fiber, especially on the inside of the apple. So the other thing I'll say is that there's no foods that are like, oats only have soluble fiber. No, they don't. They have insoluble fiber too. It's just that they have more soluble fiber to insoluble fiber ratio than other foods. So I don't tend to tell anybody they have to worry about, are you having more soluble fiber or more insoluble fiber? The only time I look at that is if somebody is in cancer treatment and they're having diarrhea issues. If there's a way that we could use soluble fiber to help sop up the water in the intestines, sometimes that's helpful. It just depends. But for the rest of the time, I'm like, you get fiber. If you get foods that are good sources of fiber, you're going to get soluble and insoluble, and that's great. You don't have to worry about it. So insoluble basically means when you put that type of fiber in water, it sinks to the bottom of the cup. It's not absorbed into the water. So it really helps to move things through the digestive system. So you can think about soluble fiber as helping to like form a stool, and insoluble fiber kind of just helps things keep moving. So it promotes regularity, prevents constipation. Foods with insoluble fibers or more insoluble fiber, wheat, so whole wheat bread, whole grain couscous, brown rice, legumes, carrots, cucumbers, tomatoes. Insoluble fiber tends to be higher in those non-starchy vegetables because non-starchy vegetables are their fiber or their carbohydrate sources are almost all insoluble fiber, which is not digestible, and that's why they don't contribute very much to your blood glucose. So they're not a starch. All right, so then the next little subgroup of grains is gluten grains or grains that contain gluten. So I think there's a ton of misinformation about gluten, and maybe this isn't such a hot topic as it was a few years ago, but just in case you don't know, gluten is actually a protein found in wheat. So yes, while wheat is a grain, which is a carbohydrate, there are small amounts of protein, and some grains have small amounts of fat, but mostly they contain carbohydrates from a macronutrient standpoint. So gluten is a type of protein that's found in wheat. And the function of this protein is to bind or hold things together and to have a starchy quality. Or like if you think about bread, if you pick up a piece of bread, it's not falling apart. Whereas if you pick up something that maybe is made from a gluten-free flour, it's more likely to sort of crumble apart. Pizza dough is another great example. It's very difficult to make gluten-free pizza dough because it just doesn't stick together, which means it's not holding the toppings on, which is a frustrating experience for the eater. But gluten is just a protein, and most of us have zero problem digesting and dealing with the protein of gluten. But some people have a big problem. A very small number of people have a very big problem with gluten. So the only time gluten is a problem is with somebody who has celiac disease or a wheat allergy or gluten sensitivity, which is a very small portion of humans. But when you do have celiac disease, it's essential that you avoid gluten. So celiac is an autoimmune disorder where the immune system sees gluten, that little tiny protein, as a foreign substance and attacks the small intestines in response to that substance being there. So those with celiac disease cannot, well, they can, but it's not good for them to consume or use any product that contains gluten. For some people, they have a physical reaction, diarrhea, bloating, all kinds of issues that make it uncomfortable. Some people don't have much of that reaction, but it can still, that autoimmune response can still cause problems in their body, and it can increase their risk of lymphoma. So it's really important that somebody who's diagnosed with celiac disease be militant about avoiding gluten. So that's why they have to, be so cautious and bring a lot of their own foods all the time and that kind of thing. However, for over 90% of humans, we don't have any trouble digesting gluten, just like this lactose thing. If you don't tolerate lactose, you know you have a problem, and there is a solution, and that's, use Lactaid or avoid lactose. If you have a gluten intolerance, like celiac disease, you need to completely avoid gluten. But for most of us, no problem with gluten. It's just another protein that our body knows what to do with, and there's no issue. So gluten, fine for most of us, not fine for a very small amount of us. Foods that contain gluten: wheat, barley, rye, oats in some cases, beer because it usually involves wheat, and then triticale, which I've never honestly had, but it's a cross between wheat and rye. So there you go, it has gluten. And then a lot of processed foods, like I said, wheat is a cheap ingredient. It has an important function in baking, especially that gluten helps to hold things together. So a lot of processed foods, they'll use wheat flour, enriched wheat flour, to help as a binding agent or something like that. And so they will use, wheat, and therefore it has gluten. But there are lots and lots of gluten-free grains. So of the whole list we talked about that is, of grains, there are several that are gluten-free. Aramanth, arrowroot, buckwheat, corn, hominy, which is another type of corn, millet, quinoa, rice, including wild rice, soy, tapioca, and actually oats, if you can get oats that weren't processed with any other gluten-containing grains. Oats themselves are gluten-free. It's just they're often processed in facilities that can be contaminated by wheat or something else. So that said, there's no reason to avoid gluten unless you have celiac disease or for some reason you think that you don't tolerate gluten. I don't think we have a good evidence-based guideline around gluten intolerance. I have a hunch, this is not a science-based, it's just a, dietitian-informed hunch, that some people who feel like they are intolerant of gluten or of wheat potentially have an irritable bowel issue going on, and there is an evidence-based diet for irritable bowel, and that is called the FODMAP, FODMAP. So FODMAP diet. So there's a whole sort of range of foods that you may need to be cautious about or look at outside of just gluten. And so I think people may, if you think you're gluten intolerant, but you're not celiac, you may want to look into the FODMAP diet and see if that's something that might actually be more effective than just avoiding gluten for any bowel issues. Okay, so a couple questions here in the chat that I want to get at. Simple sugars, I'm surprised to see honey and maple syrup on the same list. It is basically the same. Can you say it doesn't matter? Right, that is correct. So they're asking, does it not matter where you get your sugar from, whether it's from honey or maple syrup or table sugar or corn syrup? And yes, that is correct. It doesn't matter to me where you get it. To me, it matters more, how much are you using? Because by the time, you're probably not going to use a lot. Ideally, you're not using a ton of maple syrup every day. So the difference between the amount of maple syrup you're going to eat and the amount of table sugar you're going to have, any potential health benefits that maybe you get from the tapped tree, like the only thing I can think of that you get from maple syrup is if there's some kind of plant nutrients from the tree that are getting in the syrup. Minimal, right? I say that about honey too. Well, maybe there's pollen from the foot of the bee that gets in your honey, and then somehow that's going to benefit you, but the volume you're consuming is very small. I hope you're not over consuming maple syrup and honey. So to me, nutritionally, they're all equal. Now, from a cooking standpoint, they're not equal, right? Like honey is really sticky and it's a liquid. And sometimes you don't want dry sugar, like you don't want white sugar or brown sugar because you want something that's more liquid and sticky. And then maple syrup is not as sticky as honey, but it's still a liquid. So to me, it's more about the function of the sugar. I don't think you should completely eliminate simple sugars. I make a lot of really great healthy food that has added sugars in it to help make it taste right. So I would tell you, use the sugar that you need for the function you need it to use, and use as little as you need to meet the palate of what you're going for. But from a nutritional standpoint, they are basically equal because your body just breaks it down and absorbs it as glucose and uses it as fuel for your cells. All right, another question, what fruits or vegetables are beneficial to control diarrhea instead of taking medication? So sometimes they can't. I'll just say that. That sometimes food cannot solve problems. However, if you can always try. So if something's causing diarrhea, let's say a cancer treatment, you can always try by eating more digestible ones. So if you cook your fruits and vegetables, they're easier to tolerate and it's less work. It is harder for your body to digest uncooked, non-starchy vegetables, okay? So if you have cooked green beans, that's easier. If you have cooked green beans that are pureed, that's also helping to essentially pre-digest food before it goes into your intestines. And if we're talking about trying to optimize soluble fiber, Like on an apple, the skin is where the insoluble fiber is. So that's why a lot of times we'll say take the skin. If you have some diarrhea or you're having digestive issues because of radiation or whatever, remove the insoluble fiber first and see if that helps, and cook the food. So applesauce that is, it's cooked, it's pureed, and the skin is removed may be digestible and helpful to you, whereas eating an apple is not possible. So that's kind of my rule. But if those things don't work, I think, Imodium is where I would go, and I would just use that and get on a regular pattern until the cause of the diarrhea is kind of done. Now, if you have parts of your intestines removed, you may be dealing with this as an ongoing issue, and you may need to be on a low fiber or low residue or only cooked pureed foods kind of situation for a while. So that, I will say, if you've had parts or all of your intestines removed, that's when juicing, where it removes that fiber, can get you some of the benefits of fresh fruits and vegetables without the fiber. And that's a tough one. So anyway, I also say if it's this season of treatment, just get what you can to meet your calorie needs. And then we work after treatment on like building back up your tolerance to fiber. Excellent questions, everyone. Okay, next up, here's why I am not a fan of low carb diets and why most health organizations that are based on evidence-based nutrition information will not recommend a low or no carb diet. And that's because when you look at the food group, so this is just a my plate, but you can look at the Harvard plate or whatever kind of plate. I usually just draw a picture of it myself. You can use the cancer dietitian's plate. That essentially, if you remove starchy vegetables, fruits, grains, and dairy products, because they all have carbohydrates, you're removing almost all of the food groups. And what you have left is protein and non-starchy vegetables. And I don't think that's healthy. I think there's a lot of great health benefits that you get from fruits and grains and starchy vegetables and dairy products. So number one, to me, that's the common sense answer. Why would we do something that eliminates entire food groups? Number two, there's not proof that long-term that this type of eating promotes any weight loss any more than anything else, and nor does it promote health over anything else. If somebody has blood sugar issues or blood sugar management challenges, having a consistent level of carbohydrate is more important than, it's not a good idea to completely eliminate carbohydrates, because if your body doesn't regulate blood sugar very well, then you are at risk of going too low, and you need regular sources of carbohydrate to keep your blood sugar even. If you choose to try this, I would just make sure that you consult with your team, someone on your medical team who can help make sure that it's going okay and that it's not causing, issues that are negative for you. All right. So the facts are that even if you don't provide your body with a food source of glucose, so let's say you decide to do a no carb diet, your body is going to make the right amount of glucose for your brain to function. And your liver has to make it, your body has to take fat cells and basically do a lot of work to convert some of those things into glucose. And this is why initially when people go on these low carb diets, they lose a lot of weight, because this process tends to use a lot of stored water in the body. And then you lose water weight really fast. That's kind of the fast weight loss that people see when they go on low carb diets, but that's not healthy. Like, that's not good, nutritious way of eating or a way to lose weight. That's why I say when somebody loses weight really fast, to me, that's a bad sign. Something is not working right. Something's not going on right. So the process of making glucose in the context of not eating any or not eating many carbohydrates causes stress on your body. And that's not what we're looking for. Your brain goes into this mode of like, oh, we must be in a famine, so let's like crave carbs, right? Because we want them. We're kind of in a state of starvation, which messes with your metabolism. Your body naturally slows down metabolism to manage the fact that it thinks that you're in a state of famine. So none of those things, those side effects of low carb diets, none of those sound like healthy to me. Even if somebody is losing weight, that is not a healthy way to do it. Okay, so this is another reason why when somebody says sugar feeds cancer, I'm going to cut out all sugar, It's like, but it doesn't work that way. You could cut out all sugar and your body's still going to make glucose, which technically is what is, quote, feeding the cancer cells, according to this myth. So you cannot get your glucose to be too low because your body won't let you. All right. So bottom line, no, carbohydrates are not bad for you. Your brain runs on glucose, your muscles need glucose, and what's important is the type and amount of carbohydrates you consume. So most nutritious carbs, starchy vegetables, grains, dairy, fruits, right? Those are great, healthy, and nutritious sources of carbohydrates. How much do you need, though? That's the other big question. So each person's carbohydrate needs are going to depend on your age, your gender, your activity level, your medical condition. Okay, so if you are male sex, you are, say, 20 years old, and you're a marathon runner, you're going to need a lot of carbs. So anybody, it's all dependent on all of those things. If you are older, your activity level is low, you have some, blood sugar management issues, then you will want to be very intentional about the amounts of carbohydrates you have throughout the day and what types. So that said, you can, I would suggest you consult your dietitian if you need a personalized carbohydrate recommendation. Not everybody needs to consult a dietitian. You can use some common sense. So how much do you need? Now, this is very specific. Okay, so generally the recommendation is that carbohydrates should make up a significant amount of your daily calories. We're talking half or more of your calories would come from carbohydrates. So 45 to 65%. Now, I don't expect you to be counting calories. I don't expect you to be converting. If you know anything about math, carbohydrates are 4 calories per gram. So then you have to take your calorie needs for the day and then divide that by 4 and multiply it by 65%. And yes, I love math, but I'm not going to sit here and do it all for you. But just as an example, an 1,800 calorie diet someone would consume between 202 and 292 grams of carbohydrate. So for anybody who's counted carbs before, I know they're thinking what? Almost 300 grams of carbs? That's crazy. I am here to tell you 300 grams of carbs is a reasonable amount of carbohydrates for a normal human. The recommended daily amount is not to go under 130 grams a day because that's a minimum amount needed for your brain to have a good source of glucose to function. Who doesn't want good brain function? We all want good brain function. We want our muscles to feel good when we're exercising. We need carbs. And yes, this sounds like a lot to people who maybe have followed some of the low carb circles, but this is a completely reasonable amount. Now, I don't think you need to be counting carbs or counting calories. So that's the science, the nutrition science right there. So if I was calculating your needs, I would do a lot of things and I would use calculations and kind of give you a range. I don't think everybody has to do that. No, I don't. I don't do it. I don't know how much carbs I eat a day. What I will tell you is when we educate people about getting enough carbohydrates to help maintain a good, healthy blood sugar level, we're telling them to have 2 to 3 servings of carbohydrates. A serving is generally 15 grams of carbohydrates at their meals and 1 to 2 servings at snacks. So you can kind of see how if you do this at 3 meals a day and 2 snacks, that would add up to, your total for the day. It is best if you spread those carbs throughout the day. We don't want you having none and then loading up on a whole lot of them at once, which is the same conclusion I gave you for protein. Your body needs foods all day long. I'm also not a fan of intermittent fasting, but that's another topic for another day. Okay, so the other common sense guide, which is the one I use, is to cover 1/3 to 1/4 of your plate with carbohydrates. That's our plate method. We cover half of our plate with fruits or vegetables, like non-starchy vegetables. We cover 1/4 of our plate with a starch, whether that's a starchy vegetable or a whole grain. We cover 1/4 of our plate with protein, might be meat, might be plant-based proteins. If you have beans, like legumes, yes, that's a protein and a carbohydrate and a vegetable. I mean, that sounds like a pretty amazing. So sometimes your protein, if you're choosing beans, is also a carbohydrate. So then half your plate is actually carbohydrates because you've got grains and beans. Or let's say you have a glass of milk and that is counting as a serving of carbohydrate, and you're having a quarter of your plate is grain. Totally fine. Okay, so this is what a serving looks like when we're talking about a quarter of your plate, or a serving might be one or two on that quarter of a plate. It might be 2 slices of bread, right? Or 1 slice of bread. That's like a regular slice of bread, not like a biggest, enormous, fluffy slice of bread. That's generally about 15 grams of carbohydrate, a half a cup of cooked grain. So a half a cup to 3/4 of a cup of dry cereal. So what I usually recommend to people thinking just about cereal or oatmeal in the morning is that you would have fruit in your bowl first. Now, fruit is also giving you carbohydrate, but that's okay. So we want fruit, we want our whole grain, and then we might even have milk on top of that. So yes, that is a fair amount of carbohydrate in your breakfast. But if you've gone all night long and you haven't had any glucose, and your body's basically overnight, it's a long time, you have your liver is producing glucose so that you can, get through the night without dying. You've got to have that glucose in the blood. So when you wake up, you eat all this carbohydrate, it helps put it in the stores for the day. It helps replenish what your body had used overnight. Nothing wrong with this, okay? So carbs are good for you. They help your brain have that energy, and help make sure you're getting going for the day. Ideally, you're choosing the carbs with lots of fiber, lots of, vitamins and minerals, lots of other prebiotics to help your body function. All right, so here we go. There's no need to eliminate an entire food group. Complex carbohydrates are essential for health and deliver a wide range of nutrients. And yes, you can have simple carbohydrates in moderation and on special occasions. Even sugar-sweetened beverages, I'm sure you can find a way to fit those in once a week and still have a good time. So I say eat carbs, enjoy carbs. Don't let other people take the joy out of your carbohydrates. All right, so that is basically it for today. If you have other questions, feel free to throw those in the chat or the Q&A box over the next few minutes. If you could please fill out this evaluation form that I put in the chat for anybody who's watching online or listening to the recording of the podcast. Feel free to email me and I'll send you that link, because that does help me to be able to keep offering programs for free. But you will be able to find this webinar recording at cancerdietitian.com/carbs. And you can find, I mentioned the Hot Topics webinar and the Gut Health webinar. You can find all my webinars at cancerdietitian.com/webinars. And you can always sign up for my Survivor Diet email series, which is cancerdietitian.com/survivor diet. And if you want to know more about the various food groups, especially different types of carbohydrates, myplate.gov is a pretty simple website to just kind of learn about different food groups. All right, our next webinar will be July 18th at 3 p.m. I have not chosen a topic yet. If you have a topic suggestion, feel free to throw that in the chat, or send me an email with any of your ideas. I get ideas from participants and from other oncology dietitians about what they're hearing from their clients. So I always love to get those ideas from you all. All right, I'm watching the chat. I'm not seeing anything else in there. So I hope that all of your questions have been answered. If you do have other questions, you always know how to reach out to me. And I just want to give you a big thank you for joining today, because those of you who are on live, it helps to give me plenty of audience to feel like I've got someone to talk to, even if you can't talk back. I know you're chatting back. So thank you so much. I hope you all have a wonderful day, and I will catch you again next time. Bye.